My name is Mara. I was 34 the morning someone spit at my feet in front of the Lexington Avenue subway station, and I didn't yet know it was the beginning of a ritual. I remember the sound more than the act itself, the soft, wet impact. On concrete, the sharp inhale that followed, the way people nearby slowed their pace without stopping. I looked down and saw it, a slick glob barely missing the tip of my boot, and then I looked up. He was sitting on a flattened cardboard box beside the newsstand, coat torn, eyes glassy, face slack from either something he'd taken or something he hadn't had in too long. He didn't flinch, didn't look ashamed. He just stared at me, with the tired authority of someone who'd already decided I deserved it. And in that strange, electric moment, something inside me stilled. Not fear, not even disgust, but something older. Recognition. I kept walking. I was already late, and, in New York, you learn quickly how to move through discomfort like wind, but the next day, it happened again. This time with eye contact, direct, cold, calculated, like it was no longer random, like I was marked, and again, no one stopped, no one asked, no one did anything except step around the act, as if spit on pavement was just part of the city's morning rhythm. The third day I paused just long enough to look over my shoulder. I saw something I hadn't expected, a folded bill in his hand, and next to him, just for a moment before he turned away, a man I knew far too well. Lennox, my ex. Crisp jacket, sharp watch, expensive indifference. He walked past like it had nothing to do with him, but I knew that gait, I knew that face. And I knew the shape of cruelty when it was dressed in professionalism. That was the moment it clicked, not just that the spitting was coordinated, but that it had a purpose. Not his shame. Mine. I hadn't seen Lennox in nearly 2 months. We'd ended like people end when they've mistaken interest for respect and control for care. It wasn't dramatic, just cold. He said I thought too highly of myself, said I made too much space in rooms I didn't earn. He didn't like my voice when I spoke too directly, didn't like my laughter when it was loud, didn't like how I walked like I owned the sidewalk. And he especially didn't like when I stopped apologising for my skin. I've lived with vitiligo since I was 11. For most of my life, people assumed it was a burn or a rash or something I should cover up. My chest and collarbones are a map of contrast, deep brown melting into pale ivory, uneven and defiant. It's the first thing people notice and the last thing they seem to forget. Over the years I learned how to carry it, not with pride at first, but with permission. Then eventually with no permission at all. And that was the problem. I didn't hide. I wore dresses with open necklines. I posed for photos without filters. I smiled in meetings. I had the audacity to love myself publicly. To Lennox, that wasn't strength. It was arrogance. He once told me I was too self-satisfied for someone so marked. So when I saw him that morning, sliding a folded bill into the hand of a man who had just spat in my path, I understood exactly what kind of punishment this was. Not just harassment, not just humiliation. It was psychological warfare in public. A performance designed to reduce me, to shrink me back into the shell he thought I came from, to remind me, daily, that no matter how confidently I walked or how well I dressed or how brightly I laughed, I was still a woman with a blemished body in a city that doesn't stop for bruises. It wasn't enough that we had broken up. He wanted to break what he couldn't control. I remember standing on the curb, traffic blurring around me, the heat rising from the concrete. I looked down again, this time not at the spit, but at the shadow it left behind. A wet smear on grey stone, like punctuation. He wanted me to step over it, to carry it with me into the train, onto the platform, into my day like dirt tracked on clean floors. But I didn't move, not right away. I let it sit there between us. Me, him, the man on the cardboard. All three of us complicit in a moment that had been paid for and planned. People passed around me, annoyed, brushing shoulders, glancing only, long enough to register that I was in the way. That's all I was now. a woman in the way of mourning. Eventually, I stepped forward. But something changed. Not in my pace, not in my face, but inside. A shift, small, silent, but permanent. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? Who believes a woman when she says her ex is orchestrating daily, degradation using strangers as weapons? So I went underground, both literally and emotionally. I took the train to work. I put my bag in my lap. I smiled through meetings. But I started taking notes, not just on what was happening, but on how it was designed. The psychology of humiliation, the architecture of targeting. I watched where he stood, how far away he kept, who else he talked to, and I started to see it. How many other people were just like me, walking through invisible punishments in public, built not with fists, but with implication. And I started to realize that maybe I wasn't the only one. But on that first morning I was alone. Just Mara, 34, Brooklyn-born, still tired from the fight it took to exist in a body that refused to apologize. Still learning that some battles don't come with warning shots, only impact. And the first impact had landed, right at my feet, paid for, delivered, and received. It kept happening, every morning, like clockwork. I would step out of the subway station at Lexington, already bracing against the noise, the cold wind, the mental list of what I had to hold together that day, and there he'd be. Same spot, same posture, the same vacant look in his eyes. But it wasn't vacant anymore. I began to see it, the way he tracked my steps just seconds before I came close enough, how his shoulders shifted in anticipation, how the look on his face hardened ever so slightly, like a man preparing for a job he didn't want to do but had agreed to nonetheless. And then it would land, wet, sharp, precise, spit on concrete, sometimes on my boots, sometimes closer. No words, just the action. Just that horrible, hanging silence afterward, like the whole block was holding its breath and pretending not to see. I told myself it was random. The first week, I convinced myself it was coincidence, a one-time thing turned pattern by chance, or some kind of mental instability I wasn't equipped to understand. Maybe he did this to everyone. Maybe it wasn't about me at all. But it happened too cleanly, always timed to when I passed, always only me. People around us came and went unbothered. I started to change my walk slightly, a step to the left, slowing down or speeding up, taking the other exit if I could afford the extra 2 blocks. But somehow, he adjusted too. Every time. And behind it all was a deeper voice, not his. The one I knew. The one I had slept next to for nearly 2 years. Lennox. It was absurd. I kept telling myself that. This wasn't his style. He was calculated, yes, but he was clean, polished, corporate. He fought with emails and withheld praise as punishment. He didn't deal in people like that man. Or so I thought. But I kept seeing him, always at a distance. Sometimes across the street, pretending to check his phone. Sometimes in a coffee shop window, watching through the glass. Never closer than necessary, never obvious. But I saw him, and I felt him in the rhythm of it all, in the cruel precision. Still, I couldn't say it out loud. Not even to myself at first, not even in the privacy of my own thoughts. The idea that a man I had once loved could orchestrate something so low, so deliberate, made my body recoil. What kind of person does that? And worse, what kind of person lets it happen? I felt dirty just for noticing, and even dirtier for not confronting it. I froze every time. I'd keep walking, grip tightening on my bag, stomach turning but legs steady. I'd get to work, smile at the receptionist, take the stairs instead of the elevator to calm my breath, and pretend like my day hadn't started with spit at my feet and a phantom watching from the shadows. I stopped telling friends where I lived. I didn't want to answer questions. I avoided eye contact on the train. My body started to fold in on itself just slightly, shoulders hunched a little more, chin dipped, voice softer. Like if I made myself small enough, I could slip between the cracks of his attention and disappear. But it didn't work. He saw me, or maybe just the idea of me, every time. That was the point. It was never about hurting me physically. It was about presence, about being reminded, about planting an idea in my mind that no matter where I went, he still had reach. It worked. I started to question my own confidence, the things I wore, the way I stood. I'd catch my reflection in a window and suddenly hate it, my posture too proud, my chin too high, my skin too loud. I started wearing scarves that reached my collarbone, avoiding open necklines. I didn't do it for warmth. I did it to feel safe, to feel invisible. Because if I could disappear again, maybe it would stop. Maybe he'd let me go. But that's the thing about people like him. Letting go was never the goal. Control was. It's strange how fast shame attaches itself when you're being watched. Not seen, watched. I started mapping my mornings like I was entering a battlefield, calculating which shoes could be cleaned faster, which bag would be easier to shield. I changed my lipstick, switched to a matte that wouldn't smear if I cried, and yet I said nothing. I didn't tell my sister. Didn't tell my co-workers. Didn't write it in a journal or whisper it into a phone call at midnight, because to name it would mean confirming that I was being hunted, not violently, but surgically. Every move designed to chip away at the idea I had built of myself, a woman who had left the man, moved on, rebuilt. He was proving, in his own way, that I hadn't escaped anything, that the strings were still tied, just thinner now. And quieter. By week 3, I stopped being afraid of the man at the station. I saw him for what he was, another pawn, another broken piece Lennox had decided to pick up and place in front of me. Maybe he offered him food, maybe cash, maybe nothing. But the illusion of purpose. But he showed up every morning like it was his job. And in some way, maybe it was. What haunted me most wasn't the act. It was the echo of intention behind it. I wasn't being punished for hurting him. I was being punished for healing without his permission, for walking with my back straight and my scars unhidden, for finding a version of myself that didn't need to be fixed, and so he tried to stain me, not with dirt, not with blood, but with shame. But the thing about spit is, it dries, it disappears. And every morning, as much as it sickened me, as much as I wanted to scream, something else began to take root. A slow defiance, not loud, not angry, just steady. He was watching me, but I had started watching him back. He didn't say it all at once. It came in pieces, layered over months, wrapped in suggestions and jokes that felt like compliments until you tasted the bitterness underneath. He had a way of turning sentences into traps, of making you feel lucky just to be chosen before, reminding you why you shouldn't have been. The first time he used the word methodology, I thought he was talking about his work. He was a systems guy, a strategist, always obsessed with efficiency, control, streamlining people into predictable boxes. But then he used it on me. Quietly, over dinner, with a smile too calculated to be anything but a warning. He called it emotional anchoring, said I had a tendency to float, to perform, to live as though I believed the mirror more than the world. He said it like an observation, like science. He told me I wasn't like other girls, that I had too much presence, that I walked like I was owed something, like my scars were credentials instead of accidents. He said it wasn't natural. That it made people uncomfortable, that men didn't know what to do with women who didn't apologize for being visible. And so he had decided to help, to ground me, that's what he called it, a methodology of grounding, a way to bring me back down to where I belonged. He said it with the care of someone folding a shirt before placing it in the fire. When I laughed too loudly, he called it a flare-up. When I wore something sleeveless, he said it was a distraction technique. When I disagreed with him in front of his friends, he smiled and said I needed calibration. Like I was a faulty compass, like I had lost my sense of direction. He was subtle, always. There were no raised voices, no bruises, just the slow, persistent erosion of certainty. I began to second-guess the way I sat, the way I posed for photos, the way I ordered food. He'd say things like, "You really think that shade works with your skin tone?" Or, "You like being stared at, don't you?" And I'd laugh, like it was nothing. But inside, something cracked each time. A hairline fracture forming beneath. The surface, silent but spreading. I told myself it was love. That maybe he saw something I didn't. Maybe my confidence was performative. Maybe my beauty, the thing I had spent years learning to carry with defiance, was a costume I hadn't earned. He made me question the word itself. Beauty. Not the kind in magazines or movies, but the kind I had carved for myself out of survival. The kind that came with texture and marks and history. He didn't believe in that kind. He believed in correction, in realism. In placing people where they belonged on his imaginary ladder of worth. One night, months before the spitting started, I had worn a dress I loved, soft white, open shoulders, the kind that made me feel like the version of myself I had once dreamed of becoming. He looked me up and down and said, "You know, you wear confidence like someone who didn't earn it." That was the moment I should have walked away, but I didn't, because shame is a slow poison. You don't feel it until you're already too weak to run. He once told me he was doing me a favour, that if he didn't say these things, someone else would. That he was protecting me from public humiliation by giving me doses of it in private, conditioning me, preparing me. Because a woman like me, marked, too visible, too loud, was bound to be torn down eventually. He just wanted to control the pace. So when I saw him that morning at the subway station, after the second or third time the man spit near me, and I caught that flicker of a smirk on his face before he turned away, I understood the full shape of what was happening. This was the method. This was his grounding therapy, now outsourced, now public, now playing out like performance art in front of a city that didn't care enough to look twice. He hadn't changed tactics. He'd just changed the setting. He didn't want me to hurt. He wanted me to shrink. He didn't want me to disappear. He wanted me small enough to carry, to control. Because in his world, beauty was currency, and I had been spending it too freely. I had been too generous with my joy, too bold in my silence, too confident in a body that refused to be quiet. And so he decided to tax it. With glances. With comments. With saliva and shame. It worked for a while. I won't pretend it didn't. I started avoiding my reflection, stopped wearing lipstick, bought longer sleeves, changed the way I walked, the way I sat on trains. I began to study. Women who moved through the city with their heads down and their voices low, and wondered how long it had taken them to learn. To survive. But every methodology has a flaw. And his was this. He assumed that because I didn't fight back, I was breaking. He didn't know I was taking notes. That every time he reached for a string, I memorized its location. That every insult became a data point. That every day I walked through that station was a record of my endurance. He thought he was humbling me, but humility doesn't come from being spit on. It comes from standing in the fire and learning how to build shelter from the ash. I would come home and go straight to the bathroom, not to shower, not to scream, just to take off my shoes. I did it carefully, every time, like peeling off something shameful. The saliva wasn't always visible, sometimes already dry, sometimes just a feeling, imagined or not, of something clinging to the leather, to the laces, to the part of me that had touched the city while I kept my face still and my eyes forward. I'd place them by the door, soles down, always soles down, as if stepping on the act would keep it from rising again. But it never worked, because even when it wasn't on me, it was in me. There were nights I didn't eat, not out of control, but out of something smaller, more corrosive. I'd make tea and let it go cold. I'd sit on the edge of the bed with the lights off, scrolling without looking, trying to distract my body from the tension building in the back of my neck, the space behind my ribs that used to hold laughter. I wasn't sad, not really. I wasn't angry either. It was more like an echo, a low vibration in the bones. And then came the thought. Quiet. Unwelcome, but persistent. What if they were right? Not just Lennox with his polished cruelty, his slow. drip of psychological warfare disguised as concern. Not just the man outside the station who never looked me in the eye, but the others. All the others who saw me walk through the world like I deserved to be there and resented me for it. Maybe I was too much. Maybe I was trying too hard. Maybe my confidence was an illusion, an act stretched too far over a frame too fractured to weigh. Hold it. I started to watch myself in the mirror like a stranger, not judging, just observing. I noticed the way my shoulders squared too sharply when I walked, how my chin lifted by default, how my voice filled rooms with a steadiness I hadn't earned. Who had I been performing for? Who had I been trying to convince? There's something particularly dangerous about being worn down in silence, when the bruises are internal, when no one knows, when everyone thinks you're fine because you keep showing up with your lipstick neat and your jacket pressed. I became fluent in the language of pretending. I laughed at work. I delivered pitches. I made jokes at lunch, but the weight followed me home. It lived in my bones like a parasite. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just questioned. What if my beauty was fake? What if all the years I spent learning to love my skin, its contrast, its chaos, had been a mistake? What if I'd built my pride on something broken? Not the vitiligo, not the way my body bore history in patches, but the audacity, the belief that I could be seen and still be whole. It was easier to blame myself than to believe someone could hate me this deliberately. Remembered things Lennox used to say. Fragments I had tucked away behind the door of memory marked irrelevant. That I was brave for wearing that. That I seemed to enjoy being the centre of the wrong kind of attention. That I walked like I thought I was being photographed. I had brushed them off as insecurity, maybe even jealousy, but now they resurfaced like glass in the tide, sharp and undeniable. I started to internalise them, not fully, but enough to look over my shoulder when I laughed in public. Enough to lower my eyes when strangers stared. Enough to wonder if my silence would be more acceptable than my voice. I didn't stop going to work. I didn't stop moving. But something inside me went quiet. I began to turn down invitations. I cancelled brunches. I skipped events. I said I was tired and I wasn't lying. But it wasn't my body that was exhausted. It was my hope. The hope that the world might look at someone like me and not demand apology. The hope that confidence didn't have to be earned through suffering. The hope that existing, fully, loudly, visibly, didn't have to be paid for with humiliation. Each night I wiped down my boots. I placed them by the door. I climbed into bed. And I asked the question again, whispering it without sound into the dark. What if they were right? And worse, what if I had never been right? That thought lived with me. It didn't scream, it didn't claw, it just sat there, waiting for me to believe it. But even in that stillness, even in that ache, there was something else. A thread. A tension I hadn't yet named. Not resistance. Not strength. Not yet. Just a breath, waiting to return. By the third week, I stopped. Going outside. I didn't make a decision about it. There was no single moment where I stood up and said, that's it, I'm not doing this anymore. It just happened. One skipped commute turned into 2, then 3, then a full week of silence from the outside world that felt more like relief than isolation. I told work I was sick. They didn't ask questions. I was efficient, responsible, invisible in all, the right ways. No one knew what was unravelling behind the polite email replies and the calendar blocks labelled focus time. I spent most days in the same spot on the couch, legs folded beneath me, laptop open but untouched. The TV played shows I'd seen before, the kind where no one raised their voice and nothing terrible ever really happened. I let the sound fill the space because silence had begun to press in on me like a second skin. I didn't want to think, but I didn't know how to stop. My thoughts weren't loud anymore. They were low, steady, like water dripping in a room with no drain. I stopped wearing makeup. I stopped brushing my hair. I wore the same sweatshirt 4 days in a row, not out of comfort, but out of inertia. The windows stayed closed. I pulled the curtains shut when the sun got too strong. I started eating only when the dizziness reminded me. I told myself it was rest, that I was healing. But healing feels like repair. This felt like soft disappearance. I would walk past the mirror in the hallway and avoid looking up. I knew what I'd see. Eyes too tired, skin too dry, posture slumped. But more than that, I didn't want to see the question that had rooted itself behind my eyes, the one I'd been circling for days. How does someone make themselves disappear without dying? I wasn't suicidal. I wasn't even sad in the traditional sense. But I wanted to vanish. I wanted to walk through the city and have no one look at me, no one touch me, no one remember I was ever there. I started studying the way people moved in crowds, on the news, on the shows I watched, the ones who blended. Neutral clothes, eyes down, no makeup, voices barely above a whisper. I made a list of habits. I called it safety, but it was really instruction. How to shrink, how to fold yourself into acceptable dimensions, how to be harmless. I practiced in my apartment. I moved slower. I spoke less. I stared at the floor when I crossed rooms, as if someone might be watching from outside. I started to walk differently, even alone. Lighter, like my weight might offend the carpet. I stopped singing in the shower. I stopped humming when I made tea. I unplugged the speaker I used to dance to in the mornings and pushed it under the couch. Everything that made sound had to be earned, and I hadn't earned anything. Sometimes I would sit on the bathroom floor, knees to my chest, and imagine cutting off my hair again. Not for fashion, not for reinvention, but to erase, to strip away the shape of myself. I would trace the outline of the vitiligo on my chest with my fingers, over and over, not with love, but with a kind of dull curiosity. As if I could rub it off. As if enough friction could undo what genetics and sunlight and history had written on my skin. I stopped answering texts. The few people who reached out got brief, flat replies. I'm fine. Just tired. Need a break. They didn't press. Everyone's overwhelmed these days. Everyone's trying to cope. My silence didn't raise alarms. It gave them permission to go quiet too. That was part of the vanishing. You stop feeding the connection, and it withers. And no one notices until you're already gone. One night, I found myself sitting in the dark at 3 a.m, the only light coming from the microwave clock. I was on the kitchen floor for no particular reason, holding a spoon, not eating, just holding it like it might tether me to the room. My feet were cold. My mind was empty. Not peaceful, just blank. I sat there for an hour. No movement. No sound. Just breathing. And even then, even in that hollow, some part of me refused to fully give in. There was a sliver, a whisper, something, that curled in the back of my spine and said no, not yet. It didn't shout. It didn't lift me off the floor. But it didn't disappear either. I didn't know then that I was surviving. I thought I was failing. But sometimes survival looks like stillness, like waiting, like not leaving the apartment because you still believe somehow there's something out there worth returning to. It was a Thursday, the kind of grey New York day where the sky feels just a few inches above your head and everything moves a little slower under the weight of cold air. I don't know why I went out. There was no big decision, no dramatic turn. I just stood in the doorway of my apartment, keys in hand, boots on, and I didn't sit back down. I didn't turn off the light. I didn't wait for the next wave of dread. I walked out. I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel healed. I still felt fragile in that quiet, humming way, where everything inside you might fall apart if someone looked at you too long. But I walked, down the stairs, through the lobby, onto the street. My knees were stiff from so many days curled inward, but I moved anyway. And with every step, something settled back into my body, like it was remembering what it meant to take up space. I didn't walk fast. I didn't walk with purpose. I just walked. When I got to the station, my chest tightened, my hands went cold. But I didn't turn back. I descended the steps, each one an argument against everything I had taught myself. In the past few weeks, I didn't try to look invisible. I didn't fold. I didn't disappear. I was breathing loud. My boots were loud. And I kept going. And then I saw him. Same place. Same box. Same expression. The man Lennox had paid to haunt. Me, sitting like a marker between who I had been and who I was about to become. He was there, as always. But something was different now. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way my shoulders didn't hunch. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't change lanes or look at my phone or fix my scarf. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time I looked right at him, I looked him in the eyes and he looked back. There was a flicker there, something confused, maybe ashamed. I don't know if he remembered me, if I was just another face in a rotation of assigned cruelty. But I held the gaze. I let it stretch long enough for him to know I wasn't afraid anymore, long enough to break the pattern, long enough for him to see that his act hadn't erased me, that I was still here, that I remembered. And then I looked up. Across the street, right on cue, Lennox was there. Leaning on a lamppost like he always had, phone in hand, pretending to be casual, pretending not to watch, but I knew that posture, knew that patience, knew the weight of a man who thought power was in being seen while pretending not to be looking, and I looked at him too, for the first time. Not through the corner of my eye, not in the reflection of a window, not as a shadow in my peripheral. Fear. I looked, fully, directly, my back straight, my jaw locked, and I let my eyes say everything I had swallowed. I know what you did. I know who you are. You don't own me. He looked up from his phone, and when he met my gaze, something shifted in his face. It was small, barely a flinch, but I saw it. That crack. That break in the mask. That pause in the smirk he always wore like armor. He didn't smile this time, he didn't nod. He didn't raise his brows like this was some shared joke. He just looked, and I didn't look away. Not because I wanted to win, not because I had anything to prove, but because I had finally remembered something he had tried so hard to make me forget. That shame only survives in silence. And I wasn't silent anymore. I walked past the man on the box, past the stain on the sidewalk, past the corner where ghosts used to live. And I stepped into the station. The same place that had once swallowed me now watched me descend without fear. The train came. I got on, and for the first time in weeks I stood without leaning. I held the pole like a woman who knew she wasn't the problem. I let my reflection in the window remind me that my skin was still mine, my voice was still mine, my walk, my name, my history, still mine. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just existed. And for the first time, that was enough. 5 years is a strange measurement of time. It's not long enough to forget, but just long enough to become someone new. In those 5 years, I rebuilt everything, from my routines to my spine. I studied, worked, scraped by, climbed and created. I moved apartments, moved cities, and then eventually moved back. I came back to the same block that had once hollowed me out because something in me refused to let that be the end of the story. Pain should not be the final chapter. The building. On the corner was still vacant, the one where the man used to sit, the one where the shadows of my own footsteps lingered even after I'd stopped walking that way. The facade was cracked, the windows were boarded up. People walked past it like it had always been nothing. But I remembered everything, and I knew exactly what I wanted it to become. The idea had been with me since the silence, since the months, when I had taught myself how to move again, a place where women like me could walk in without apology, where people who had been stepped over, silenced, weaponized could rest, eat, wash, breathe, begin again. Not a clinic, not a shelter in the cold municipal sense of the word, but a space that felt like reclamation, like breath. It took 2 years to secure the building, 1 year to raise funds, another to renovate. We painted the walls warm colours. We planted flowers outside. We built a kitchen where nothing was rationed and no one was turned away. I didn't name the why place after myself. I didn't want that. It wasn't about me. It was about what had been broken on that street, and what could now be stitched back together with soft hands and real food and no shame. Opening day was quiet. We didn't do a press release, just opened the doors and waited. And they came. One. by one. Word travelled fast, as it does among those who live close to the pavement. By noon the waiting area was full. People sat with blankets wrapped tight, eyes unsure, shoulders drawn. But they were there, and that meant something. Just before 5 p.m, the bell on the door rang again. I was in the back, helping fold towels. One of the volunteers called for me, said someone was asking for the director. I walked to the front without thinking, wiping my hands on my jeans. And there he was. I recognised him before he spoke. Time had softened his face, blurred the edges. But I knew. The eyes, the posture, the quiet way he looked at the floor and not at me. It was the man from the box, the one who had spat at my feet because someone else had told him to. The one who, for weeks, had been the blade at the end of a hand that didn't belong to him. He was thinner now, paler, but his clothes were clean. Someone had helped him recently. His hands shook a little. He held a crumpled flyer from a community board across the street. I saw my handwriting on it. Hours. Services. A line at the bottom. No judgment, no prerequisites, no explanations. He didn't recognise me. Or if he did, he didn't say so. He just asked if we had work. Any kind. He said he was trying to start over. Said he'd cleaned up. Said he wanted to help. His voice cracked when he said the word help. I stared at him for a moment too long. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with the weight of memory. I saw him as he had been, on the sidewalk, on repeat. And I saw him now. Tired, real, human, and I said yes. I told him we needed someone to help with deliveries, to move boxes, to keep the kitchen stocked. He nodded, said thank you 5 times. I asked his name and he gave it. I didn't say mine. He came back the next day. And the next. He showed up early, worked hard, never asked for anything beyond the task. We paid him like we paid everyone else. Fair, on time, no questions. The other volunteers liked him. One of them started teaching him how to drive the new van we'd bought with a grant. He was good at it. Calm, patient, reliable. The first time he opened the door for me, it was raining. I was carrying 3 boxes and my arms were soaked. He ran ahead and held the door open wide without a word. I walked through, nodded, kept going. But inside, something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not closure. Just balance. The street that had once taught me fear now gave me a version of peace I hadn't thought possible. Not because the past was undone, not because I had won, but because I had built something better than revenge. I had built a place where people could change without being erased. He was no longer the weapon, and I was no longer the target, and both of us, in some quiet way, were free. There's something surreal about watching a man who once stood guard at the edge of your pain now stand at the door of your success. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like quiet. The kind that settles deep in your bones, not because you've forgotten, but because you've moved past needing the memory to speak for you. Every time he opens the door for me now, black-gloved hands, posture straight, eyes calm, I nod, step in and sit without flinching. I don't watch for the spit. I don't watch for the echo. I watch the city pass through the tinted windows and think of all the ways I used to fold myself in half just to avoid being looked at. It wasn't my plan to end up here. I never dreamed of limousines or spotlights. I didn't rebuild my life for the sake of proving anything. I rebuilt it because I had no choice, because something in me refused to vanish, because the world I wanted to live in didn't exist, and so I carved it out of brick and sweat and grief and grants and hours no one saw. I built a place where the forgotten could be held, not punished, where bodies like mine were not labelled defective, where confidence didn't have to be apologised for. I didn't expect it to be seen, but it was, first by the local papers, then by the city, then by people who had power and didn't know what to do with it. One article turned into 10, a keynote, speech turned into a national conference, a photograph turned into a cover. The first time I was invited to the gala, I almost said no. I didn't know how to walk into a room like that and not remember the sidewalk, the spit, the ache of boots by the door. But I went. in a long black gown that left my shoulder bare. I stood on stage and talked about dignity, about damage, about how resilience wasn't something we owed the world, but something we owed ourselves when the world refused to see us clearly. And afterward, when I stepped into the car waiting out front, he opened the door, the same man. Clean-shaven now, in a crisp uniform provided by the private transportation company that contracts with our foundation. He didn't flinch when he saw me. He didn't look away. He just nodded and held the door, and I stepped in. The first few rides were quiet. Neither of us spoke. There was no apology, no acknowledgement. But there was understanding, a quiet exchange of weight. He drove carefully, never too fast, never too sharp on the brakes. He knew the value of gentleness now, and I didn't need to ask for it. Eventually we talked, not about the past, but about the work. He asked how the shelter was doing. I told him about the expansion plans. He told me about his certification exam, about how he wanted to build a life that didn't depend on second chances. I listened. I didn't forgive him, because there was nothing left to forgive. What he had done, he had done. But people aren't. Fixed points. And the man who opened my door now was not the man who had sat on that box with hate in his throat. Sometimes people ask me how it feels. To come full circle, to rise. They want the satisfying answer. They want rage alchemized into gold. But it isn't that simple. Healing isn't spectacle, it's texture, it's slow, it's stepping into a car with a man who once humiliated. You are not letting it shrink you anymore. It's smiling, not because you've won, but because you don't need to. I return to that block often, not to relive it, but because the shelter is there, because my team is there, because that street, that corner, that station, they don't own my story anymore. They're just locations now. Coordinates on the map of where I learned to stand without permission. He still drives sometimes, not always, but enough. And each time he opens the door for me, there's a pause. A breath. I step in slowly. I smile. Not out of triumph, not out of performance, but because I remember, and because I'm not angry anymore. I didn't come back to punish anyone. I came back to show what it looks like when you survive without turning, bitter. When you rise and take others with you, when you walk back into the fire you were forged in, not to burn, but to light the way.